Hello there, you're watching the press preview. Our first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. Over the next half an hour, we're going to be seeing what's making the headlines with the Mail on Sunday commentator Dan Hodges and the writer Ellie Mae. So very good evening to both of you. So let's take a look then at what's on the front pages. And the Times leads with a top Tory party donor accusing the Prime Minister of mishandling Brexit and souring business relations. The Eye reports that it's only a matter of time before the so-called Islamic State launches an attack in the UK using drones. The Guardian features a photograph of Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh after fleeing the violence in Myanmar. Also on the front page is a warning from the head of NATO that converging threats are making the world more dangerous than it's been for a generation. English charities are given far less lottery money than their counterparts in Scotland. That's according to the Daily Mail. The Telegraph is reporting fears that hackers may have stolen the personal data of up to 44 million British consumers in a massive cyber attack. A new study suggests that eating too much dark meat can increase the risk of diabetes. That's on the front of the Daily Express. And the front page of the Star covers thousands of British people who are preparing to flee from Florida as Hurricane Irma heads for the state. So plenty to talk about there with Ellie Mae and Dan Hodges. And we're going to turn our attention to the front page of the Times. They are leading with a quote, or a quotation. May is hopeless and weak. Who's saying it then?
Well, you may see this headline, May is hopeless and weak, and think, well, we've all heard this quite a lot recently, but this is an attack from Lord Harris of Peckham, who is a former Tory party treasurer, who is incredibly brutal and scathing about the Prime Minister, and obviously that brutality is reflected in the headline. Now, I think within Downing Street, that they're used to, they've got a bit of a thick skin to some of this criticism. But I think what will be concerning them this evening is this is obviously on the front of the Times, which is obviously traditionally a supporter of the Conservative Party. And although we haven't got it here, my understanding is there's also quite a critical piece in The Sun about Theresa May's comments Theresa made in her Test Match special interview today, and about how that relates to Hurricane Irma and her going to the cricket when she should have been dealing with the crisis. And I think there will be some concern tonight within Number 10 just about what is actually happening in the sort of the Times and Sun stable, and whether or not this is the start of quite a concerted and sort of aggressive push from the Times and the Sun and obviously Mr Murdoch towards the Prime Minister. It'd be very interesting to see how that plays out.
Well, yes, and if that's right, I mean, what next potentially? I mean, there doesn't seem to be an obvious candidate lining up to take over, is there?
Well, it's funny you should say that, because I was just thinking that as Dan was talking. I was just thinking, it's interesting to see there being a concerted push against Theresa May, but I just really don't know who they would replace her with. I mean, this week we've seen Jacob Rees-Mogg invited onto Good Morning Britain, as a potential replacement. David Davis was touted as a potential replacement. It seems to me, obviously, Labour did actually pretty well under Jeremy Corbyn in the end, but it kind of reminds me of the problem that Labour had in 2015, which was that there just didn't seem to be anybody suitable to replace Ed Miliband.
Well, I'm told deep in the article, Lord Harris suggests Ruth Davidson could be a potential candidate.
Ruth Davidson's somebody who impresses a lot of people within the Conservative Party, but obviously Ruth Davidson has effectively ruled herself out, certainly in the short term, because obviously she's not a member of Parliament. So, but I think you've answered your own question there, which is there is no one obvious to take over at the moment, and I think that's why, despite all the sort of leadership speculation that continues to swirl around, that is the fundamental. The Tory party just at the moment does not have a candidate who they believe they can put in place, or B, a candidate who they can believe they can put in place without tearing the Conservative Party apart and delivering Downing Street to Jeremy Corbyn.
And can this kind of criticism, do you think, have any tangible impact, given that he's criticising her handling of Brexit? Could that have any impact on negotiations, undermining Britain somehow when they were getting attacks from within, if you like? But also, does it have an effect on getting policy through? Does it further weaken Theresa May? Does it give Labour more strength when policy goes through the House of Commons?
I think, there's several things at play here. I think, first of all, that Britain is in a weak position in terms of Brexit. I think the leaks this week kind of show that, and I don't think this will have helped. I think Theresa May is a bit of a laughingstock in Europe now after the election. So I think that's one thing. I think the second thing is that there is genuine fear in the Conservative Party about Corbyn taking power because Corbyn's beliefs are so different to Conservative beliefs. So I think that possibly that is holding back the Tories from being as ruthless as they might be because they're genuinely afraid. And I think, it's producing a kind of interesting effect within the Tory party where they're obviously angry, frustrated, they want her to leave, but they're also paralysed at the same time. And I think that's why we're starting to see lots of these stories of them kind of slagging her off, basically.
What effect could it have? I mean, how important is Lord Harris for a start, and what impact could his words have?
Well, as I said, I mean, obviously he is somebody of some influence within the Conservative Party. He's not somebody, I think, who would necessarily be a household name, frankly, within his own household. So, and I think the fact that as I say, that this is a story that has such prominence on the front page of the Times. As I said, I mean, I think it's something that the Conservatives will be looking at with some alarm as how this, how this is, as I say, getting such prominence. I mean, the reality is, if the Conservative Party could think of a clean and easy way of replacing Theresa May, they would have replaced her within about 5 hours of the election result. But obviously, they don't see a route to doing that. Ellie Mae's absolutely right. They are terrified of the prospect of Jeremy Corbyn premiership. I have some sympathy with those fears.
Do you know what? I was just thinking, isn't it nice? It's my first week back on Sky Papers and we're agreeing.
It just wouldn't have been the same.
Right,
it just wouldn't have been. It wouldn't have been the same.
Fragile truce is over.
Absolutely. Thank goodness for that. And welcome back. I've missed you. But as I say, at the moment, there is I still don't see any short-term solution to the leadership issue.
OK, let's move on to the story which, of course, have dominated the airwaves and the newspapers over the last few days, and that is the terrible, devastating trail of Hurricane Irma, which, of course, has Hurricane Jose or Jose, depending on how you pronounce it, following close on behind. And the exodus they're referring to seems to be concentrating on Florida, which is likely to be hit over the weekend.
Well, yeah, this is, and this straight off the back of Hurricane Harvey, of course, which caused more devastation to Texas than Katrina did to New Orleans. And the president of Antigua has said that, much of the country has been destroyed. 250,000 people have been urged to evacuate Florida. That really can't be emphasized what a catastrophic event this is. And the reason I was sort of insistent that we talk about this, and the reason for that is because we need to start talking about climate change. The fact is that we know that climate change makes hurricanes more likely and crucially more severe. We know that. So while we can't say definitively this hurricane was caused by climate change, we can say that this climate change made this hurricane more likely and made it more likely that it would be this severe. And climate scientists call this decade zero, because what they mean by that is this is our last chance to change direction before catastrophe hits. And we're talking food shortages, we're talking cities underwater, we're talking absolute catastrophe if nothing is done about climate change. And it is preventable. We can change direction. We do have the capacity to do that. And I'm concerned about how little it's been talked about, except for, commendably, Caroline Lucas and Jeremy Corbyn have both talked about climate change in response to this. But other than them, it has not been talked about, and time is running out to avert disaster on this. And that, I think, is what we need to be talking about right now.
And President Trump has called it this hurricane of epic proportions, perhaps the biggest that we've ever seen. But President Trump, we know, is not the person to take up that fight and that cause, is he?
He cut NASA's
necessarily
climate change budget, so... Yeah.
I mean, I think that's right. Although, given one of these hurricanes is, I understand, heading towards Mar-a-Lago, then maybe that might.
Well, hopefully,
that
yeah.
might. Well,
There'll be some
hopefully,
kind of calmer even if it doesn't make him.
I wouldn't go so far as to say I hope that the place gets hit by a hurricane, but I mean, certainly
hopefully it'll make him listen.
It might concentrate his mind. might. I mean, I've got to say, I'm not entirely sure I agree that there's been some sort of prohibition on debating the issue of climate change. I mean, I think that's sort of something
No,
that,
I'm not
that
saying
people have
about
been...
prohibition, but I'm saying I think that if a proportionate reaction to something like this would be that every headline, it would be treated with the same severity as Donald Trump getting into arguments with Kim Jong-un, because it's that level of
But is it the problem
severity
that you
of climate
can't link
change.
one hurricane directly to climate change? Is that the problem?
Well, we can't link one hurricane directly to climate change, but we can link hurricanes to climate change. And climate change is happening now, today, and it's the biggest existential crisis facing humankind. And we really do need to start talking about it, because we've got little time left to resolve it, but we still can. And so that's why I really hope that we do have this conversation, because, I mean, look at that. I don't want to see that happen ever again.
Yeah,
And
appalling
we need to
destruction.
do everything that we can to stop something like that. Those poor people.
That's right, and with another hurricane on its way. And just to show you, go back to that paper that we were on before, because it is an extraordinary photograph that's on that double-page spread, showing the roads out of Florida. One way out of Florida, of course, that road north, and the number of people that are making their way out to try and get to safety. We are going to take a break. Plenty more to talk about after the break, including what happened when Theresa May brought brownies to the test match at Lord's today. You referred to that a little bit earlier on, or the interview anyway. We'll tell you more about it in a moment. Welcome back. You're watching the press preview. With me tonight, Ellie Mae and Dan Hodges. We're turning to the front of The Guardian, which has a very gloomy headline, quoting a warning from NATO saying that the world's at its greatest risk for a generation. What are those risks that it's talking about?
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously, we were talking before about the risk from global warming, but this, I think, is a comparable risk. And you've obviously got Jens Stoltenberg there, the Secretary General of NATO, basically saying, obviously, the sort of, if you like, the passive aggression of Russia at the moment is representing a very real threat. Obviously, we've got the situation in Korea as well, and obviously, I think what's even sort of adding to that risk is obviously traditionally we have had this sort of NATO alliance, which has helped keep the peace in Western Europe and to a broader extent the world generally. And obviously that alliance is now coming under pressure, not just externally, but obviously internally, because obviously we've had Donald Trump, raising doubts about the viability of NATO. Ellie was talking before about her hero Jeremy Corbyn and what he's been doing on climate change. He's someone else who has basically been sort of, in a sense, undermining certainly the Labour Party's commitment.
Only
to
you would
NATO.
find this story
And-
as a way of bashing Jeremy Corbyn, first of
Well,
all.
you were
And
using
second of all, I
global
wouldn't-
warming as a way of praising Jeremy Corbyn, weren't you? So
Because it was
you were
directly
saying he's
related
the
to
only
the-
person who's ever actually spoken about global
Because
warming.
what
Him and
I'm not.
Caroline
I'm not
Lucas
this
are
is
gonna
very-
save
I'm not
us.
splitting hairs over this. It's very silly. But just to be clear, I'm a professional political commentator. I don't treat current politicians as heroes. They're there to be critiqued when they do bad things and praised when they do good things.
I see. Well, I don't remember that much critiquing of Jeremy Corbyn when we've been doing our newspaper reviews.
Oh, you covered that aspect.
I cover it for both of us still.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay,
Very
well,
good.
I'm going to move on because we haven't got a huge amount of time. And
That was
and the-
productive. We talked a lot about NATO then.
The eye covers one of the threats, I guess, that NATO is no doubt referring to, and this is the threat from so-called Islamic State. But they're talking about a very specific threat from ISIS, and they're talking about the future threat of drones.
Yeah, I mean, this is very scary, because obviously one of the things that we've seen, to horrific effect over the last few months and years is the changing nature of the terror threat. Obviously, once it was bombs. Now we're obviously seeing these appalling car and sort of van and lorry attacks, and this is just potentially the next stage down the line. And obviously the problem with drones is, as we say with other forms of attack, how can you safely guard against it? How can you protect the public against these sorts of threats? So that's another rather sort of grim headline that we've got this evening.
Yeah, very gloomy. Let's turn our attention to the Sun, because it's always nice to have an excuse for a good row. Brexit, I'm sure will, just the word, I'm sure will get you hot under the collar. And their headline there, Bojo versus no-go. Explain.
It's very easy to explain, which is basically Boris thinks that Brexit will be fine, we'll have a good deal, and Yanis Varoufakis, because he was the Greek finance minister when Greece was negotiating terms.
He was another of your heroes, wasn't he? Wasn't he another of your heroes?
I like him. I also have criticisms of him, but they're kind of irrelevant to what we're talking about here. So I have met him a couple of times. He's very charismatic and rides a motorbike.
Charismatic, eh?
He is.
Charismatic. Right.
He's a funny guy. But yeah, he was the finance minister when Greece was negotiating deals with its deal with the EU. And as we remember, the EU was incredibly belligerent and didn't really give Greece much rope. So Varoufakis is saying here that basically Britain is going to have a tough time. It won't come back with a deal, and the EU isn't really interested in kind of what Britain's needs are. Basically.
And Boris insists we will get a deal.
Yeah, and I mean, this comes to the key of the whole, for me, of the whole Brexit debate. I mean, obviously we're hearing a lot about transitional arrangements. We're hearing a lot about parliamentary timetables, etc. But the bottom line is, firstly, can ministers deliver a deal? And secondly, will the EU allow them to deliver a deal? Because there are some in the EU, it's quite clear, who want to basically teach Britain a lesson over this Brexit process and send a warning to other member states: if you try and leave, this is the price you're going to pay. So this gets to the very sort of the heart of the matter, despite the slightly comical image of Boris in his tank.
Indeed. Not the first time we've seen a comical image of
Boris.
Boris.
And I'm sure it won't be the last.
Absolutely. Let's finally move on to, well, we're not really talking about cricket, are we? We're talking about Test Match Special, though, of course, because they had a special guest on today.
Theresa May attended the cricket briefing. As I said before, she's actually had some criticism in some quarters, but this was the sort of the lighter part of the interview, in which she tried slightly tortuously to compare herself to her hero Geoffrey Boycott, and was saying how he was a cricketer who's famous for simply just getting his head down and just carrying on regardless and ignoring criticism, and that's how he was successful. She also did reveal as well, which I thought was interesting, that he's stolen her Tupperware, because apparently she took some brownies in today, and she apparently had previously taken in some brownies. Not only did Geoffrey Boycott make off with the Prime Minister's brownies, he made off with her Tupperware and has yet to return it.
I'm really enjoying The Guardian's kind of bitchy introduction to this article, which is sort of describes Geoffrey Boycott as a former England cricketer who was eventually sacked from his county captaincy amid an acrimonious dressing room revolt.
What do you think they mean?
Yeah, what could they be referring to? No wonder she likes him so much.
We must leave it there. Apparently she made them with her own fair hand, the brownies.
She did.
On that very important note, we must leave it there, but you will be back again at 11:30 with another selection. For the moment, thanks both.